Before the world learned to carve ideas into stone or paint memory onto papyrus, before Europe whispered the first legends of philosophy or Greece recorded its earliest scripts, there was a vast expanse of earth that breathed knowledge long before its name was ever written on a modern map, a place travelers, traders, and ancient scholars quietly called the land of writing. And today, as we journey into the heart of West Africa's intellectual dawn, I ask you to breathe deeply, to open your imagination wider than the deserts that stretch across that landscape, because the truth waiting there is not just history. It is a light meant to reach every person who has ever been told their past was small, their culture was late, or their people arrived at knowledge only after others had led the way. For too long, the narrative of global civilization has been shaped by the loudest storytellers, not the earliest thinkers. And this is the hour when we reclaim what centuries tried to cover, when we lift our eyes to a world that wrote its brilliance into the dust of time before Europe even found its own alphabet. In West Africa, among the Nok clay sculptors, the Nsibidi scribes, the Mande traders, the griots of the Sahel, the Dogon skywatchers, and the brilliant kingdoms that glowed along the Niger River, writing was not just a tool but a breath, a tradition, a sacred inheritance that bound communities, preserved laws, recorded astronomy, documented trade, encoded diplomacy, and protected knowledge carried across generations. Long before classical Greece carved its first alphabet around 800 BCE, West Africa was already shaping symbols into living languages. And if the world does not know this, it is not because it did not happen. It is because the world rarely listens to the quiet genius of Africa's past unless we stand up and insist it be heard. When we speak of ancient writing in West Africa, we are not speaking of one script but a constellation of intellectual traditions, each shining with its own brilliance. Travel to the deep rainforests of southeastern Nigeria and you find Nsibidi, a symbolic writing system whose exact origin is lost in antiquity, but whose visual sophistication places it among the world's earliest complex sign languages. Imagine symbols so advanced they could record secret societies, legal codes, marriage contracts, and entire philosophical ideas long before Greek letters ever existed. These were not random drawings, they were part of a literacy system embedded in architecture, clothing, artistry, and ceremonial governance. Yet Nsibidi was only one star in the night sky. Move across the vast Sahel, and you encounter Tifinagh, the script of the Amazigh and Tuareg people, a writing system dating back thousands of years, carved into stones that still sit in the Sahara like messages from humanity's child. Go to ancient Mali, and you find libraries in Timbuktu and Djenné filled with manuscripts on medicine, mathematics, astronomy, law, geography, and poetry, some written on pages older than Europe's medieval university. Wander among the griots of Senegal, the sages of Niger, or the scholars of Songhai, and you discover memory traditions so precise, so surgically accurate that modern researchers marvel at how 1,000 years of historical detail can be recited without a single written page. West Africa was not the land of silence, it was a land of encoded knowledge, intellectual fire, and linguistic innovation that blossomed long before Greece learned to write its name. And yet the question lingers, if West Africa was so rich in writing and intellectual systems, why does the world almost never speak about it? The answer is painful but powerful, because much of what Africa built was intentionally dismissed or destroyed by centuries of bias, colonial interruption, and historical erasure. But the beauty of truth is that it cannot be buried forever. Archaeologists, linguists, anthropologists, and historians are now uncovering page by page and stone by stone the incredible reach of Africa's genius. Clay tablets, rock carvings, manuscript libraries, archaeological layers, oral lineages, and surviving symbols are rewriting global history with every discovery. And as these discoveries rise to the surface, a new generation is awakening to a fact that should have been shouted from the rooftops long ago. Africa was not behind. Africa was ahead. And to understand that is not to diminish anyone else's culture. It is to restore balance to a world that has leaned for too long on incomplete stories. When you look at Nsibidi, you are seeing a writing system created by people who understood abstraction, symbolism, diplomacy, and art at levels usually attributed to ancient Asia or the Mediterranean. When you look at Tifinagh, you witness the technological creativity of desert cultures who turned their harsh environment into a canvas for communication. When you look at the manuscripts of Timbuktu, you realize that African scholars were discussing planetary movement, chemistry, algebra, medical surgery, and jurisprudence at a time when much of Europe was still struggling through the early Middle Ages. When you look at the Dogon astronomical records, you find knowledge so advanced that even modern scientists debate its origins. And when you look at the griot tradition, you see a civilization that mastered memory to such a degree that writing itself became optional, not absent. West Africa's literacy was not always alphabetic. Sometimes it was symbolic, sometimes numeric, sometimes oral, sometimes carved, sometimes painted, sometimes sung, but always intentional, always organized, always intellectually rich. So why does this matter today? Because understanding the depth of West Africa's ancient literacy is not just about celebrating the past, it is about empowering the present. When a child of African descent hears that their ancestors were among the earliest authors of human thought, they walk differently, think differently, breathe differently. When a society understands that its roots are not defined by oppression but by innovation, it gains the confidence to build boldly again. When the world recognizes that humanity's intellectual beginning was not confined to a few civilizations, but shared across continents, it becomes easier to respect cultures that have been marginalized. And when we teach this truth loudly enough, we begin to dismantle the myths that robbed millions of their heritage and replaced it with silence. You are not here today to simply learn a fact, you are here to reclaim a flame carried by scribes, scholars, travelers, builders, astronomers, and storytellers who walked this earth thousands of years before you. They left symbols on stones in the Sahara. They carved scripts into the trunks of palm trees. They etched knowledge onto leather scrolls. They preserved mathematics in chants, astronomy in proverbs, law in poems, genealogy in memory, and philosophy in symbols. They understood writing not as ink on paper but as the breath of civilization itself. And as you listen to this history, you must also listen to what it calls you to do. It asks you to stand taller. It asks you to challenge the limits you were taught. It asks you to break free from the narratives that told you your past was dark. It asks you to remember that your ancestors built light long before the world admitted. So today, let the truth rise in you like a second heartbeat. West Africa was called the land of writing before Greece, not because someone romanticized the past, but because Africa carved knowledge into the earliest chapters of human history. And now that you know, you carry a responsibility to speak, to teach, to create, to rebuild, to write new futures with the same courage your ancestors wrote their ancient worlds. Their genius did not end with them, it survives in you. Their script is in your blood. Their brilliance is in your possibility. And no matter where you live, no matter what you were taught, no matter what obstacles surround you, you must remember this. You come from a people who carved thought into eternity. You come from a land that wrote before the world believed you could. And the next chapter, your chapter, begins the moment you choose to rise and continue the story. Our ancestors were not waiting for history to happen. They were writing it long before the rest of the world knew how to record its own story. And when we speak these words, we are not just honoring memory, we are reclaiming a truth that was buried under centuries of distortion. West Africa did not sit in silence while other civilizations documented their philosophies. It was actively shaping the world's earliest intellectual traditions, carving symbols into stone, painting meanings onto walls, encoding laws into symbols, and building libraries in desert cities where scholars from across continents gathered to study from African minds. For too long, the world repeated the lie that Africa was a place without writing, but the truth is far more powerful. Africa's writing systems were so numerous, so sophisticated, and so deeply woven into its cultures that they existed in forms the world did not understand and therefore dismissed. Yet dismissal does not erase brilliance. It only delays recognition. Nsibidi signs flowed across the forests of southeastern Nigeria long before the Greek alphabet even existed, recording diplomacy, ethics, communication, and secret knowledge. Tifinagh symbols were being carved by Amazigan Tuareg travelers into the Sahara stones before Europe had its first libraries. The griots of Senegal and Mali carried genealogies, histories and scientific knowledge with such precision that modern scholars still marvel at their accuracy. The manuscripts of Timbuktu preserved astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, geography, and poetry, while Europe struggled through centuries of instability. These truths stand as reminders that African civilizations were not passive recipients of knowledge. They were generators of it, shaping intellectual frameworks that influenced trade networks, governance systems, and intercontinental ideas. Nothing about this was accidental. Civilizations with writing do not appear by chance. They appear because their people refuse to let knowledge be lost, because they understand that wisdom must outlive the body, because they see learning as a responsibility, not a luxury. And Africa embodied that truth with a confidence the world has yet to fully acknowledge. When you erase a people's writing, you attempt to erase their presence, and for centuries many tried to do exactly that to Africa, by ignoring its scripts, burning its manuscripts, overthrowing its temples, and misinterpreting its symbol. But Africa's ink was carved into stone long before any empire attempted to silence it. The Sahara is still covered with inscriptions older than Greece. The forests still hide ceremonial symbols that hold stories of law and lineage, and the deserts still protect manuscripts whose pages defy every myth told about African inferiority. Colonizers burned libraries because they feared knowledge. They dismantled institutions because they feared memory. They erased names because they feared legacy. But even fire cannot destroy what has already become part of the earth. The writing systems of West Africa were not fragile. They were resilient, coated into fabrics, carved into calabashes, woven into rituals, etched into sculptures, performed in ceremonial dances, and preserved through oral mastery that surpassed the written traditions of many societies. And this resilience teaches us something vital. When a people know their identity at the core, no force can permanently silence them. The scripts of Africa survived because the spirit of Africa refused to die. People can be displaced, kingdoms can be conquered, but truth, when carried with enough conviction, becomes indestructible. The world believed Africa had no script, but it was Africa that taught humanity how memory becomes civilization, and this is the truth that must rise again in our generation. Writing is not merely ink on a page. Writing is the act of preserving thought, the discipline of organizing wisdom, the courage to declare that your story matters enough to be recorded. Africa did this in multiple forms: symbolic, numeric, pictorial, ritualistic, oral, and alphabetic, and the diversity of its systems shows that literacy is not a single road but a continent of pathways. The Nok did not need parchment to record their cosmology. Their terracotta figures spoke in cultural code. The Dogon did not need scrolls to preserve their astronomy. Their knowledge was inscribed in rituals aligned with celestial patterns. The Yoruba encoded philosophy in Ifa verses, a mathematical and linguistic system so complex that scholars compare it to binary computing. The Mande preserved political ethics in proverbs woven through epic poetry that carried more information than entire books. The Igbo embedded history into Nsibidi, which communicated through symbols both simple and profound. The Sahelian kingdoms documented law and science in manuscripts that today remain among the world's most advanced pre-modern records. So when we say Africa wrote before Greece, we are not speaking in exaggeration. We are simply speaking the truth the world avoided. And understanding this truth does more than correct history. It strengthens identity. It restores pride to children who were told their ancestors contributed nothing. It lifts the spirit of men and women who felt disconnected from their greatness. It reminds the African diaspora that their lineage is not defined by chains but by intellect, innovation, and written legacy. It proves that the world's most powerful civilizations were shaped by people who refused to let knowledge die. And it calls each of us to carry that same fire, to write our own chapters with the same courage, to honor the brilliance that came before us by building futures that reflect the greatness we inherit. When you erase a people's writing, you erase their presence. Because writing is more than marks on a surface. It is the physical proof that a civilization believed its thoughts were worthy of permanence, that its experiences deserved to outlive the moment, that its worldview carried enough weight to be passed on to generations not yet born. And that is why so many empires throughout history understood that the first step to weakening a people was not the sword, but the suppression of their memory, the distortion of their past, the destruction of their archives, and the interruption of their storytelling. Yet in West Africa, long before foreign powers arrived with their own scripts and alphabets, there existed a foundation of writing so ancient, so deeply embedded, and so structurally resilient that even deliberate attempts to erase it could not fully succeed. Africa's ink was not limited to books that could be burned or papers that could decay. Africa's ink was carved in stone, etched into calabashes, inscribed on walls, woven into ceremonial garments, encoded in symbols, performed in ritual, and preserved through oral intellectual systems that were as precise as any written archive. When colonizers tried to destroy manuscripts in places like Timbuktu, they did not understand that the knowledge those pages contained had already been memorized by scholars who could recite entire books word for word. When outsiders dismissed Nsibidi symbols as meaningless decorations, they did not understand that those symbols were carrying laws, marriage codes, diplomacy records, and philosophical teachings that had been passed down for hundreds, even thousands of years. When foreign writers claimed Africa had no writing system, they were unaware that the continent had multiple Tifinagh in the Sahara, Ajami in the Sahel, Nsibidi and Igbo Vai script in Liberia, Bamum script in Cameroon, and ancient proto-scripts carved into West African rock art long before Greek letters existed. But the deeper truth is this: Africa's writing survived not because it was hidden, but because the people who carried it refused to let it fade. They understood that knowledge is not fragile when it is woven into the identity of a community. They understood that writing is not only done with ink, but also with memory, craftsmanship, symbolism, and cultural continuity. Erasure fails when a people turn their entire lives into libraries. And even when manuscripts were burned, they rose again in the voices of griots, who could recount centuries of genealogy without missing a single name. Even when symbols were banned, they resurfaced in secret societies, encoded into dances, body art, and architecture. Even when colonial administrators declared African languages inferior, those languages found immortality in proverbs, epic poetry, sacred chants, astronomical calendars, and mathematical systems that required no pen but operated with the precision of scientific formula. The world assumed literacy must look like parchment, ink, and bound volumes, but Africa proved that literacy can live in stone inscriptions left behind by desert travelers, in carved messages preserved in caves, in meticulously memorized histories guarded by lineage keepers, in symbolic writing that predates modern alphabets, and in intellectual traditions so advanced they challenge the assumptions of contemporary historians. So when we say Africa's ink was carved in stone, we are saying that Africa built its legacy in ways that fire could not destroy, that conquest could not silence, and that time itself could not erase. We are saying that Africa's intellectual systems were not fragile, they were durable, adaptable, and deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life. We are saying that a civilization's power does not rest on how the world perceives it, but on how completely it believes in its own identity, its own memory, and its own work. And this truth matters today more than ever, because millions of people of African descent have grown up hearing that their ancestors contributed little to the world's intellectual story. They were taught that writing came from elsewhere, that knowledge flowed into Africa rather than out of it, that literacy was a gift delivered to them instead of a legacy taken from them. But when you understand that Africa had writing systems older than Greece, manuscripts older than medieval Europe, and symbolic literacy older than many Asian alphabets, something inside you begins to shift. You begin to stand differently. You begin to think differently. You begin to realize that your story did not start in darkness. It started in brilliance, in innovation, in creativity and intellectual mastery that was so far ahead of its time that the world is still struggling to fully understand. And once you awaken to that truth, you can never again see yourself as small. You can never again let someone else define your value. You can never again accept silence where your history should shine, because you come from a people whose writing survived fire, war, colonization, and erasure, not because it was lucky, but because it was eternal. The world thought Africa had no script, but it was Africa that taught humanity how memory becomes civilization, because long before writing was defined by ink or parchment, Africa understood that the true foundation of a society is not the tools used to record knowledge, but the discipline to preserve it, the wisdom to structure it, and the courage to pass it on faithfully across generations. Civilizations rise not through monuments or armies, but through the continuity of memory, and Africa mastered that continuity with an elegance the world rarely recognized. In West Africa, memory was not an accident, it was a science, a craft, a social responsibility built into rituals, education systems, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and governance. The griots of Mali and Senegal carried entire national histories in their minds with an accuracy that modern scholars still struggle to comprehend, reciting lineages that stretched back centuries, speaking of battles, treaties, migrations, and dynasties with the precision of written archives. The Yoruba encoded their entire cosmology, ethical systems, and philosophical teachings into the Saifa corpus, a structure so mathematically complex that modern researchers compare it to binary computation and information theory. The Igbo preserved law, identity, and spirituality in Nsibidi, a writing system so visually sophisticated that it could express actions, emotions, relationships, and social contracts without a single alphabetic letter. The Dogon embedded astronomical knowledge in rituals aligned with movements of the stars long before telescopes were invented. The Mande recited political charters like the Kurukan Fuga, an ancient constitution memorized and transmitted through generations, proving that literacy can live through disciplined memory as powerfully as through written text. And this is why Africa stands as proof that civilization does not only grow where there is paper, it grows where there is commitment to legacy, to continuity, to the preservation of human thought. When the world dismissed Africa as a continent without writing, it was only revealing how narrow its definition of writing had become. Writing is not the shape of letters, it is the structure of knowledge. It is the capacity of a society to encode ideas in a way that survives time. And Africa did that through symbols, through chants, through mathematics, through oral archives, through carved stones, through painted signs, through architectural design, and through communal memory built into the lives of the people themselves. In many African cultures, memory was not stored in libraries, it was stored in living minds trained from childhood to remember thousands of verses, thousands of names, thousands of historical events. This was not a lack of writing, this was a mastery of a different kind of literacy, one requiring such depth of discipline that forgetting was nearly impossible. And the world, not understanding this brilliance, mistook it for absence. But absence is not what Africa left behind. Africa left structure, law, cosmology, diplomacy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, agriculture, architecture, metallurgy, and entire systems of governance preserved through intellectual traditions that have outlived empire. Europeans burned African manuscripts because they feared the knowledge inside them. Colonizers banned African symbols because they feared the unity they represented. Scholars dismissed African scripts because they could not decode them. But even when pages were set on fire, memory survived in the voices of griots. Even when symbols were outlawed, they flourished underground in masquerades and secret society. Even when African knowledge was stolen, it resurfaced in proverbs, encoded in rhythms, woven into textiles, and passed down through families who refused to let the story end. And so when you look closely at Africa's past, you discover a truth that transforms the way you see the world. Africa taught humanity that civilization is not built by those who write the most words, but by those who preserve the most meaning. Every script Africa created, whether Nsibidi symbols, Tifinagh inscriptions, Bamum script, Vai writing, Ajami manuscripts, or ancient rock carvings, was an expression of a people who understood that knowledge must travel across generations to become power. And every memory Africa preserved, whether through epics, chants, rituals, genealogies, or proverbs, was part of an intellectual architecture older and deeper than many of the world's written traditions. When you recognize this, you begin to understand why Africa's legacy could not be erased. You begin to understand why, despite colonization, enslavement, and centuries of erasure, African identity continues to rise with unstoppable force. The story survived because the people carried it not in books but in their blood. They passed it through their breath, through their art, through their ceremonies, through their symbols, through their songs, through every tradition designed to keep memory alive. And that is why the world can no longer ignore the truth. Africa did not fail to write, the world failed to. And once you reclaim this understanding, once you realize that you come from a lineage that shaped civilization through memory so powerful that even fire could not destroy it, you begin to walk with a new kind of strength. You carry yourself with the confidence of those who know they descend from thinkers, creators, innovators, and knowledge keepers, who did not wait for validation from the outside world. You belong to a heritage that taught humanity how to preserve wisdom, how to encode meaning, how to sustain culture, and how to build civilization itself. And once you awaken to this truth, nothing in this world can ever make you doubt your worth again.